My name's David. Let me start sharing my screen. Hopefully this works. I'm on Linux, so you never know. Do you see it?
Yep, that's good.
Yes. Cool. So, David, I'm a senior machine learning engineer. I work at DeliveryHero. Quickly, I will tell you what DeliveryHero does, then kind of tell you why we wanted to use Metaflow, kind of how we're using it, and I don't know, Q&A is just if there's time. Doesn't really matter. There's actually just a thank you slide. So quickly, DeliveryHero it's like a food delivery company. If you think of something like DoorDash or Uber Eats, it's like that, except it's a conglomerate of many of these companies. So it's not just like DoorDash, it's like DoorDash in many different countries and many different regions. And each company kind of like operates on their own, but we create a lot of stuff for all the, consumer companies, I think they're called, the consumer platforms, in the central office here in Berlin. So here are some of the brands, and you don't need to know any of this, but just know it's like really big. There's all sorts of things, and we are just in logistics. And so what you have to know is like there is a huge amount of like data processing for all of this. So for all the orders, all the locations of the drivers, like all this data gets put into our data warehouse. And it actually all gets processed basically through an Airflow setup. Like all this kind of runs through this one little Airflow thing here. And this Airflow repo is like a single repo. It's really great if you want to do something and you never have to change it, like, the data processing that they do. As a data engineer, because it's just kind of doing the same thing every day. But if you're a data scientist and you kind of have a new idea, it's quite difficult to like just try an idea out. So basically what you have to do is create a repo with your code. CI/CD will build a Kubernetes, will build an image for a Docker image for you. And then in the Airflow repo, you have to create a PR with like a very standard, basically DAG. And you can't really change the structure of this. And only one person can like test their idea at a time because you have to like set this kind of Airflow variable. It's all very complicated. It takes a long time. Generally, people don't love using it, but for things that are already running, it already works. So nobody like thought of doing anything else. And so, we came up with like Metaflow. We were like, okay, we want this whole process of you having an idea to you being able to get it in production to be fairly quick. And so, yeah, I mean, I find that especially with newer projects, like almost everybody is using Metaflow. They really love it. It's also really easy to like develop locally or develop in the cloud, depending on like how much resources you need. We work in, I think it said 70 countries. It might be 50. Doesn't matter. It's a lot. Some are bigger than others. So usually you can like test out your idea on a smaller country and then scale it to not only the larger countries, but all the countries. So, you can be working with hundreds of megabytes of data to, hundreds of gigabytes of data, basically, and kind of scale out that way. And then there's like a huge infra team that has our Kubernetes setup. Another thing that's actually one thing that we have to like think of is that our whole Kubernetes setup is actually pretty complicated. So there's a lot of like authentication, like SSO authentication for our AWS cluster. And then there's also, our GCP credentials. And then there's also now you do cross-cloud stuff from AWS to, we use BigQuery a lot. So you're doing a lot of AWS to BigQuery on GCP. And this can be pretty complex. And, as like the data scientist, you don't really want to be like dealing with credentials and, cross cloud stuff like that. You kind of just want it to work.
Quick
And
quick
go
question here,
ahead.
David. So
Yep.
so is it fair to say that new services or new data processing jobs are written in Metaflow and the older ones that were in Airflow continue to be as they are? Or is there more like migrating from Airflow to Metaflow?
Yeah, so we have started migrating some of the older projects.
Okay,
Many of the older projects, when they're migrating, they're actually using Metaflow more for experimentation, is what we found.
I
So
see.
because because of the advantage of Metaflow, like artifacts and stuff like that, they
Right.
use Metaflow for experimentation, but then for the production runs, they actually continue to use Airflow. And that's part of it is we don't have enough like capacity as the machine learning engineering team to actually like force
Mhm.
people to go to the production, like use Metaflow for production, but actually it's possible. And
Okay.
projects that are already the newer projects are kind of doing that already.
Got it.
So now how we're using Metaflow, we kind of have a similar setup, I guess, where we're building a Docker image. So basically we have a project template that like we have everybody use. It asks you a couple questions. Because we're in a gigantic company, like one of the big things that, is important is actually just like cost tracking. So like just putting the right labels on everything you do. Um, so we have this project template. We basically you clone your repo from there. It kind of has a bunch of commands. Like we use a runner called justfile, which I'll get to in a moment. But it does all the like CI building your images for you, putting it into the Docker our ECR, and also kind of having the ability to authenticate with all the different various services that you're going to need. And so this is also like kind of much simpler than before because now all your flow logic lives in your own repo. You don't have to make like a PR to this mono repo where it literally takes 25 minutes just to run the unit tests in CI, which are running on like 50 nodes or whatever. And so you can like just do this. If you make a change to your code, you can run it with 30 commits, which is nice. I mean, it's nice to be able to test that. We have things in place so you don't actually like run that in production. And then also nice that you can run it in locally or on Kubernetes, like either with Argo or with Kubernetes. Like we have a lot of people using Argo actually. I find the data scientists like to use Argo more than they like to use the with Kubernetes. But it's definitely both are there, which is nice. And they can basically iterate what they're doing much faster than before. Because before they had to like basically wait for this Airflow instance to build, and then if two people wanted to have two different flows, sometimes you'd even have to like share this staging Airflow instance. And now it's all kind of just like separated in Kubernetes. And since we were already using Kubernetes, like we don't manage our Kubernetes clusters really. Like we can add things to it, but I don't manage like the node groups or anything like that. We just have the infra team, the platform team, they manage the Kubernetes cluster, they manage CI like drone for us. We kind of build our own drone pipelines, but they manage drone itself. And so there's a lot of that, which is nice because Metaflow already works pretty well with all of that. Especially Kubernetes, because we use a lot of like the cost tracking stuff. So if we didn't have that, I don't think we would really be able to use it. So some of the like customizations that we've used are this thing called Just, which is basically like a makefile, but much simpler to use. So because we use we basically dynamically set the Kubernetes image that we use for Metaflow at runtime based on like what branch you are in your Git, like what Git branch you're on, or if you're on a Git tag, it'll like decide, it'll prefer tag, but then it'll use branch because we built both images. So it kind of does this before you, like as you're running the command. It basically sets these variables just before it runs the command. Another thing that I find is really happens a lot is that since we have all these authentication things, a lot of times, just running the commands, just running the Metaflow commands will fail, but not actually fail fast. They'll fail very slowly. They'll just like freeze. And it's because you're just not authenticated with AWS or like something like that. Or you'll try to run something on Kubernetes with an image that doesn't exist. So like I can kind of quickly show this maybe. We created like a bunch of these commands, and one that we use a lot is, and it kind of just checks to see if you have all these things.
So what is it doing right now? It's checking whether each step in the flow has
Well,
access to AWS credentials.
Yeah, so there are several things. We have maybe 20 different K8 like Kubernetes clusters.
Nice.
So you have to make sure you're choosing the right one. You have to make sure that you have access to the S3 bucket. Like our logistics has our own authentication, but like we also have maybe people from other teams that have started using our Metaflow, and now we have to give them access to our bucket basically, or our whole like AWS account.
Got it.
But this thing will just tell you like, oh, you don't have access to this. It's not going to work. As opposed to kind of Metaflow will just give you some, 403 error or something, something like that.
So the expectation is that a developer or a data scientist would run this first, ensure that they have access and everything works, and then run the flow.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
It also does things like it makes sure that you are always using the correct namespace. So like we set the names. We have actually 2 namespaces right now, and there could be plans for more, but we kind of have a staging namespace and I think this was back in the slides actually. We have staging namespace and a production namespace. So, I mean, the big difference is with the staging namespace, you can read some data from production, but you can't really write to production. And in production, you can write to production, but you can't read from staging. But, things like that. And with the command, we just have it's called just flow, and then it just runs your flow basically. Or we just have just flow -prd, and then it sets the things to all be like all be production. So it's like pretty easy. It's not like rocket science, and I don't have to go telling everybody like set this environmental variable for you or set this Metaflow config file. And then also because a lot of data scientists are working in different projects, we couldn't just like kind of set one. I mean, we could have a different config file as Metaflow has, like with different, I don't know what they're called in the config file world, but it's like different versions of your config file. We found that to be a little clunky, and then it still didn't always solve the problems of our authentication things being correct. So we would need to set you need to set like your AWS profile variable to use the correct AWS profile. And this is not like in the Metaflow config, it's actually just like we do it in that just file, and it sets an environmental variable at runtime. So yeah, these were some of the nice things. You know, every project is in its own repo. So like now you don't have the mono repo, everyone can do it. I think with that, another thing that people like is that you don't have to use that like specific structure. So generally the structure of the old DAG was, you know, get the data, do some data processing, validate your data is good, train a model, or, you know, branch out into all 4 regions, branch out into all 50 countries, run your models, then kind of merge it all. But you always had to like run that static DAG all the time, even if there were like hacks where you could kind of say like skip this step, like skip this country, kind of a no-op of that country, but it would still have to run it. It still runs it as like a no-op. And so whereas Metaflow, you kind of can see actually what you want to do and dynamically set the number of regions and countries, which is nice. And you can even go to a lower level. So like you can go to a city level. Some models train at the city level. Some go even below the city level. And you can kind of decide how to do that. Or let's say your model is really fast, you could just kind of have like global models or regional models. And that's also very easy to do. Yeah, again, kind of use all of our existing Kubernetes infrastructure, so I don't have to like deal with figuring all that out. And it also plays nicely with it. So we have like alerts for a lot of things. Kind of iterating. Okay. Let me go back here. I think one thing that's actually pretty nice that we've done, oh, I don't have it here, but actually with the Slack notifications, like we kind of made our own Slack notifications, and we kind of have all this deep linked to each other. So in these dashboards, like every dashboard kind of has a link to every other dashboard. And it found it super easy to, you know, in Argo also, we like put a link to the dashboard, and we put a link to the Metaflow UI in the Argo dashboard. We created like a Metaflow card that creates a link to the Argo dashboard. So people can easily jump back and forth between those, because that's something, you know, people are like, oh, where's my flow in Argo? I got to go to the Argo UI and like search this, you know, search it if it's not on top. But yeah, now we just have it where there's like a link. Even have some, so this is like an example of the just file. You know, we kind of set all these environmental variables, and then we have this just flow, which kind of runs your flow, just production flow, which sets 2 variables and then runs your production flow. And then in this namespace, we have different like secrets is how we kind of manage the authentication. So you're kind of using a different account if you use a different namespace, because the secret's different, even though it's named the same. Try reloading. Never seen this. All right. Anyways, this is like an example of our Slack messages. So I think there's an open PR for something that looks like this. We just added links to our dashboards, and then I think the first 5 failed pods, which you can get, which are kind of nice. And this is like, there's like a pod level dashboard. The really nice thing about this is that when you click one of these, you can also see the logs from the pod. And so sometimes a little easier than searching through the Metaflow UI. Not always though. I mean, a lot of people like using Metaflow UI as well. This is kind of an example of the dashboard. I can actually just show it to you since this is that dashboard. So this is like a failed flow. I click the link, kind of shows what the resources were used. It doesn't have the logs on this one, but if we went to like the pod level of this, you could also see like at the pod level, the individual logs of the pods themselves. And then yeah, we have some more dashboards, but I don't think those are super interesting for everybody. And then, yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. Like, if anyone has any questions.